In pretty much the majority of the world, Karl Marx is viewed unquestioningly as an important thinker, philosopher, and voice who helped shape anthropology and labor science. He didn't get everything right, and had a lot of things we over the years have proven to be wrong, but that's true about every single thinker of the time. In most of Europe, they have streets named after him. He is taught neutrally or positively in most textbooks and classes, and they have an active communist or at least socialist political party. However, all that changes when you get to most English-speaking nations. America especially, but Australia, the UK, and South Africa have a specific hatred of Marx. In the US, he's pretty much associated with the devil when discussed in most primary schools. And why the difference? Why was Marx's memory viewed at least neutrally and socialist parties allowed to actively operate while he's vilified in English-speaking nations? One of the interesting disconnects Americans have that made communism sound so radical is a difference of living styles between the colonized nations and other old European nations. For much of European history, people lived under essentially feudalistic communism. The commune was incredibly normal to Europeans. Only in the last 100 years had people begun to abandon their communal villages in Europe and move to cities to work in factories in the first industrial revolution. And it was this automation of labor, building off of each other exponentially until the rich owned everything and the poor owned nothing, that Marx built his entire thesis on. He called it the Communist Manifesto because people had spent their lives in communes for centuries, and he viewed that as 100% normal, and under his new form of communism, people would revert back to their natural state, but instead with automation and industry and democracy and social freedoms instead of the lords owning and ruling everything. For America, this concept was unthinkable. We spent 400 years not living in communes and living more independent and isolated. This sounded like a barbarian nightmare to us. In fact, China and Russia had only just broken away en masse from the feudal commune just 40 years prior. For them, this was absolutely normal because they had been living that way for about 1,000 years, and many were still living in these old feudal communities owned by the kulaks or wealthy landowners in Russia. In fact, Tsar Alexander II called the liberator, realizing that to have actual industry, serfs needed to be able to move around the nation where jobs were needed if they wanted to stand a chance against the rest of the world. So in 1861, just 4 years prior to America emancipating their slaves, he promoted that all serfs who were essentially slaves of their lords were now free. However, to prevent a palace coup from the lords, he basically said that for the next 50 years, the serfs had to pay back their lords, and after that, they would no longer owe anything to their lords. So it was basically slavery, but with extra steps. And like the US, the serfs were now allowed to move around the nation to work on big building projects, and then send back the money to family and their former lords. Essentially post-Civil War sharecropping. It wasn't, however, until the 1880s that any form of real industrial revolution came to Russia. I highly recommend you listen to the latest season of the Revolutions podcast if you're interested in this in more detail. By the time Lenin and Stalin came to power, the lords had been shifted over to just the landowners that employed poor people to work their farms. Stalin purged the kulaks, many to their deaths, or the gulags, which ended up backfiring because the kulaks were the ones who had kept all the farming knowledge away from their people. It was a great way to keep their people controlled, sadly. And Stalin believed a pseudoscientists and thought they were just decades away from essentially robot servants. If he ground his people into the ground, so millions of Ukrainians died of starvation, so they had to put up signs telling the Ukrainians that cannibalism was actually bad. For Americans by the end of the 1900s, living in a commune sounded alien and barbaric, which is why not even socialism, his transition mode until automation reached a level that made production so cheap, it literally could be everything according to one's ability and everything according to one's need that communism could be fully implemented. Americans, Canadians, Australians, Kiwis, and South Africans and other African whites were homesteaders and had owned their own individual land and often slaves for generations now. This sounded just terrible. The UK, on the other hand, was on the tip of the spear of both the First and Second Industrial Revolutions and had been the European nation most distant from feudal communism. In fact, the Communist Manifesto was written the way it was because Ingalls lived in Manchester, where coal-powered factories began taking off for the first time, and his family owned one of those factories, and they saw firsthand all of the abuses of workers that Adam Smith had criticized about the First Industrial Revolution, but now accelerated even more. You will notice I didn't mention Ireland. They were too busy being deliberately starved by Britain at this point to be able to have a negative opinion on Marx. Britain, not being a traditional nation of landowners, was able to get a socialist or Labour Party in their nation, but socialist parties really didn't take off for the most part in other English-speaking nations. Too many had the frontier independent spirit and the idea of sharing property, not personal property, but the Roman concept of private property, where people had the right to use and abuse their excess, unused land or machines as they saw fit, just sounded terrible to them, especially since there was so much land taken from the native peoples that they could keep expanding into. Workers tricked into moving to company and coal mining towns and treated essentially as prisoners began to join socialist movements and unionizing. They even got a socialist third-party candidate until 1920, where Eugene Debs had to spend the last election campaigning in jail as he had spoken out against the war and Wilson had made that illegal, but even at his peak the Socialist Party was tiny. Although Helen Keller and Woody Guthrie were proud communists who loved the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it was under McCarthy and Truman that people were blackballed and stripped from their jobs and treated as traitors if they had any socialist or communist sympathies, even though most Western socialists and communists had boycotted the Third International when run by the USSR because they viewed it as communist in name only and just an authoritarian dictatorship. But the name was beneficial to both America and the Soviets that the identity stuck. Nostalgia for a free frontier, most likely manufactured, came roaring back in the 50s, and because anything that had even a whiff of socialism or controversy could land you in hot water, similar to outspoken socialist Charlie Chaplin, who had to leave the country and ended up in Switzerland for the rest of his life. So every single movie in the 50s, for the most part, were cowboy movies, a fake genre created mostly out of whole cloth to elicit nostalgia for a frontier past that never really existed, when all you needed was grit and perseverance to get ahead, and none of that nasty labor disputes or fighting for basic human rights. That was a given in the Free West. Evil employers were a rarity and definitely not systematic, and clearly wore black hats. No, Indians were the enemy who could be slaughtered like our modern zombies, and the viewer would feel no remorse or sympathy for them. They were obviously savage. At this point, having true communism, even in the post-scarcity era, will be next to impossible in most English-speaking nations. Thanks to our frontier attitude and mindset, we have lost so many of our social skills to be able to deal that closely with people we disagree with or dislike. I think the best we could hope for is state-run socialism for the essentials like food, medicine, education, mass transit, and housing, with ridiculously low overheads, along possibly with a guaranteed basic income, and kept in check by anarcho-syndicalism, where unions own and run the businesses, while anarcho-communes would exist independently by people who chose to live that way, but I really don't see them as viable for most of the English-speaking peoples. It's why we really need to aim at German-style co-determination, breaking corporations and capitalism's hold on government, so workers can have equal representation and can then vote to shift ownership of companies that get too large over to the workers who actually know what the company needs and will work even harder if they become part owners. English speakers are too independent to live in communes, and the internet now allows us all to pick and choose who we associate with, and not based on who is close to us geographically. For some nations and cultures, communism could still work, but for ones who have been inundated by both capitalism and frontier ideals and experiences, communism is dead even in the post-scarcity era. I see this genie never going back in the bottle once it's out. A commune would feel stifling to many except those who are hypersocial already, and certainly not with the rise of autism spectrum diagnoses. But then again, the new generation coming up weren't flooded with the frontier spirit. I'm kind of blown away how well people just 10 years younger than me are great at networking, even among the lower classes, something you would have never seen from my class and generation growing up. So who knows, maybe Marx was right, and the commune is natural, and we, through weird twists of fate, through mass migration and propaganda for capitalism, beaten into our heads are the bizarre anomalies. Only time will tell. This channel is helped tremendously by the generous supporters on Patreon. A big thank you to the wonderful Joe Taylor, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Ogrel for their support at the $10 a month Wapawet level. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.